Hi, my name is Rich, and about a year ago I finally learned how to make my own pie crusts. I had always been using store-bought crusts, but when I finally learned to make my own, it was amazing how much better it made the whole pie. Now, this actually came to mind when I was preparing my sermon for this week. So I want to show you how to make a chocolate pecan pie, and in between I want to talk to you about the scripture lesson that inspired me to start baking again. Well, a pie crust is really simple. You start with about 1 1/4 cups of flour. Now that's 150 grams of all-purpose flour, and I use a scale because precision is important. And in fact, precision is one of the themes that we have because Jesus is very precise in the language he uses in the passage we're going to discuss. So here's that 150 grams of flour. And to that, I'm simply going to add 1/4 teaspoon of salt. And then there's 1 stick of butter that I've chopped into pieces. And I'm going to cut the butter into the flour. And a tool that makes it so much easier that really got me going is a pastry cutter. It just looks like this. It's only about $8, $9 on Amazon. And it really allows you to get the butter worked into the flour. So I'm just going to put a few pieces into the flour at a time and begin to work it. Now, as I do it, I'm going to talk about the scripture, which was this passage in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 22, verses 15 through 22, where Jesus is in the temple and religious leaders are trying to trap him by asking him a question about whether it is lawful to pay taxes to Caesar. And instead of answering directly, he first asks them to produce the coin that's used to pay the tax. And that coin, which is called a denarius, is a Roman coin. And that coin represents about a day's pay for an average worker. And the tax that they're discussing is a tax called the census. And census is the word from which we get census. It's a tax that's paid per person. And so each person, regardless of how wealthy or poor they were, had to give over this denarius, which would cost the average worker a day's pay. And since a day's pay is, barely enough to live on, you could expect that Jesus would understand that this really hurt the poor, and he might be offended by that. So they're hoping that Jesus is going to give a bad answer. And really, they think that either answer he gives is going to be bad. If he says that it's okay to pay the tax, the people won't be happy because they don't like this tax. And if he says that it's unlawful to pay the tax, well, then the Romans will arrest him for sedition. Now, we're just going to keep working this butter in until we have a nice, dry, crumbly mixture, and you should still be able to see bits of butter within it because that's what makes for a flaky crust. You see, when you bake it, the butter melts and it leaves air pockets in the crust, and that's what makes it flaky. So I'm going to keep working on this, and we'll come back for the next part as soon as it's done. Okay, so now I've got a nice crumbly mixture, and to this we're going to add 1/4 cup of cold water, except I'm not going to add it all at once. I'm just going to put in about a tablespoon at a time. And then as I add the water, I'm going to work it together, and it's going to form a dough. Now I've added the water completely, and we've formed the dough, And what's happening is that the glutens have been activated. So as soon as we were able to turn this dough into a nice ball, what I'm going to do is wrap it in plastic wrap, put it in the refrigerator, and you can leave it there as much as overnight, but no less than half an hour, because we need to allow the glutens to relax. Because if you don't let the glutens relax, then you'll end up with a tough crust. So we're just going to take this dough, and we're going to wrap it in plastic wrap, put it in the refrigerator, and in the meantime, I'm going to make the filling. Okay, so the filling is like a regular pecan pie filling, except that we also add a 1/4 cup of cocoa. And I like to use Ghirardelli cocoa. It has just a wonderful, rich flavor to it. So we're going to begin by melting a stick of unsalted butter. Now, the melting of the butter is done at a low temperature, and we don't want it to get too warm, because we're also going to add a cup of corn syrup, a cup of white sugar, the cocoa powder, 1/4 cup that I just mentioned. We're going to add a teaspoon of vanilla. I've measured all these out in advance, and 4 eggs. Now, we need a little bit of heat in order to help the sugar dissolve into all of this mixture. But we want the mixture to be relatively cool, at least cool enough that it doesn't cook the eggs when we add the eggs, because otherwise what you end up with is scrambled egg pie, and that's not very tasty. So while the butter's melting, I'm just going to continue the scripture story that we were talking about. So Jesus has asked for this Roman coin, this denarius, and then he looks at it, and he asks the people who are questioning him, whose head is on this coin? And of course, it's the head of Caesar. But when Jesus asks that question, he doesn't use the word head that we see in our English translation. Instead, he uses a Greek word that came directly into English, and it's the word icon. This is a very particular word that would have resonated with them upon hearing it, because about 200 years before Jesus, the Hebrew scriptures, the Torah, had been translated into Greek. And when they translated it into Greek, of course, one of the passages they translated is the creation story, where it talks about humans being created in the image of God, except that that word image was translated as icon. We were created in the icon of God. So when Jesus asks whose head is on the coin, his question is whose icon is on the coin. And the answer is that the coin has the icon of Caesar. But you and I, we bear the icon of God, because we were created in the icon of God. And this is critical to understanding what Jesus says to them to answer their question. Now I'm going to continue adding these ingredients. I'm going to melt the butter. I'm going to add the sugar, the corn syrup, the vanilla, and then I'm going to add and the cocoa, and then I'm going to add the 4 eggs last, whisk it together, and when it's all whisked together, I'm going to add half of the cup of chopped pecans. Now, it can be about half, but we're going to add half into the mixture itself, and then when we pour the mixture into the pie crust, we're going to top it with the remaining half. So I'm going to continue on and do that, and then we'll go back to grabbing our dough from the refrigerator and rolling it out to make the pie. Hi, so now the filling mixture is cooling. I've pulled the refrigerated ball of dough that has rested out of the refrigerator, and I have a pastry mat that I like to work on. I also have some flour, because you always need to dust the surface that you're working on whenever you're working with dough, or else it's going to stick pretty badly. You want to dust the rolling pin as well. And so you always need to have that extra flour around to help with the process. The baking mat's great because it has measurements on it, so you can make sure that you've rolled it out enough to be able to fit this 9-inch pie plate that I have ready and waiting. So now I'm going to roll this out. I'm just going to flatten it down, and then we're going to roll it out as best we can, and you'll see that there will be some, the dough has still, you can still see bits of butter within it, which is what's going to make it flaky when it's done. And so I'm just going to press it out until I need the rolling pin to get it out the rest of the way. Now, to continue the story, when Jesus talks about the icon of Caesar being on the coin, he then gives an answer to them that they didn't anticipate. He says, give to the emperor the things that are the emperor's, and give to God the things that are God's. But when he says that, I don't think he means to separate our lives into a realm of the secular world and a realm of God. Instead, I think that what he's saying is that we need to give to God things that are created in the image of God. Give to Caesar the things that have his icon, but give to God the things that have God's icon. And what has God's icon? You and me. So we need to give ourselves to God. But what does that look like? What does it look like to give our lives to God? Are we supposed to just spend every moment in prayer and contemplation? That's not a bad thing, but I don't think that that's necessarily what Jesus is saying. Instead, I think that we just need to give our lives to God by involving God in all of our lives. And that's where this pie crust comes in. You see, when we finish this pie crust, it's going to hold the pie together. But the funny thing about a pie crust is that nobody eats pie crust by itself. And also, nobody I know eats pie filling by itself. Instead, what you want is for every bite to have both crust and filling in it. And I think the same has to be true of our lives. That every piece of our lives should have God in it. God needs to be involved. Now, how do we do that? I think that we can spend more time thinking about God during the day as we go about our daily tasks. How often have you said a prayer when you arrive at the office, that your day would honor God in the way that you work? Or how many of you have said a little prayer before you run a simple errand, just to make sure that you're remembering that God is with you even in the routine things of life? You see, I think a lot of us may be in a habit of praying to God at the start of the day and at the end of the day, but I think we need to involve God all the time. We need to have God be like this crust. We need to have a bite of God in every part of the lives that we experience. And when we do that, I think that we will find that our lives are so much better than we ever knew they could be. So now I'm just going to take this crust. See how I'm rolling it onto the pin, and then you take it and you roll it back out over the pie pan. Okay. I'm going to take a couple pieces where I've got and heal a couple of places where it's separated. And then I'm just going to trim around the edges. I'm going to trim around the edges. And you can, take your fingers and make those indentations around the edge so that you have, the nice little fluting that happens on the edge of the crust. And what we're going to end up with is a crust that is a part of every single bite that we take. And that's the way it needs to be, including God in our lives. So now I'm going to take this and I'm going to pour in our filling. I assure you, this smells amazing. And then I'm going to top it with the remaining chopped pecans. And then we're going to bake it in the oven at 325 for 55 minutes. It'll puff up pretty high while it's baking, and then when it cools, it will settle back down. So here it is. I'm going to pop this in the oven. Well, here's our pie hot out of the oven, and I can't wait to taste it after it cools down. And remember that a good crust holds the pie together, and it's the foundation of a great pie. And God holds our lives together and is the foundation of a great life if only we'll remember to include God in every part of our lives. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this, and if you did, please leave me a comment or drop me an email. The full recipe is going to show up on screen in a few seconds so that you'll be able to take screenshots of it. But thanks for watching, and I've really enjoyed spending this time with you. Have a great day.